Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show, where we're going to be doing, I guess, a little bit of philosophy of science and some kind of crossover with experimental philosophy and social science as well. Where I've got two guests with me, Peter Vickers, who's the first author, along with a bunch of co-authors on a paper that we're going to be discussing and engaging with a response video that's about this paper. And then also Lance, who works in experimental psychology and experimental philosophy at Cornell University. So thanks for both kind of coming on. Peter, do you want to say a little bit about what your background is first, and like just a super quick intro then to the paper to give people an idea of what the project is?
Sure, thanks, Nathan. Yeah, I'm a philosopher of science based at the University of Durham in the UK. I've been working on, broadly speaking, the relationship between science and truth for about 15 years. And that culminated in a book called Identifying Future-Proof Science. So that came out a couple of years ago. And part of that book, the idea is that one of the best ways we have to know when science has hit upon the truth is when there's an absolutely solid international scientific consensus, especially where it's obvious that that consensus is based on a big wealth of scientific evidence. So it's not just an opinion poll or scientists giving their hunches or intuitions, but rather, you can see that that consensus has been hard won based on solid scientific work over years or even decades. And that, in a sense, is what the book is arguing for, that sometimes we know science has hit upon the truth, and that's because of these special circumstances, which are relatively rare, because usually scientists are quite eager to disagree with each other. Now, the project, though, needs to be distinguished from that, because not everybody who came along on this project agrees with everything in the book. So I want to make it really clear that, the book is one thing, and that's my thing. But then what I was able to convince all of those other co-authors was, so 35 people came on board with this project, was that it was important to measure scientific opinion. And sometimes that's because, there's a consensus and you want to show that sort of concretely. But sometimes it's because, there isn't a consensus, but people think there is. So that's just another reason you might want to try and measure scientific community opinion. And when we looked at the ways to measure it, it looked like there wasn't a good way to measure scientific community opinion. There's some examples out there of people trying to do that, but we felt like there was a better way to do that than the status quo. So we basically set about trying to come up with a new and better way of quantifying or assessing scientific community opinion.
Great. So, I'm sure for people listening, there's like maybe a ton of questions that have come up in what you're saying about scientific consensus, how much we can trust that, what it means, methodological questions and things. And I'm sure we'll kind of get into some of those details, because basically what we're going to be looking at is there's a science YouTuber, ex-theoretical physicist, Sabine Hossenfelder, who's got like a really popular YouTube channel, who made a video kind of like being quite critical about this paper. Sabine has a lot of very strong opinions about philosophy of science and scientific methodology. And I guess they sort of come across in her criticisms of this paper, because she's very kind of upset with the project and kind of points out what she sees to be some flaws. So we're kind of going to engage with that criticism and kind of go through each of the points that Sabine makes, stopping along the way and just kind of hoping to, I guess, clarify and point out places where you might feel the objections kind of miss the mark, or kind of clarify how the objections are or engaged within the paper, or how you might respond to a kind of concern that's legitimate or something like that. So unless there's anything either of you want to say, Lance or Peter, I can just get started with the video. Okay. So yeah, just give me a shout if you want me to pause it at any point, and I'll do that.
I come across a paper that makes me want to never look at a scientific journal again. This is one of them. It's a group of philosophers and sociologists who want to regularly poll scientists to keep track of the scientific consensus. For this, they conducted a proof of concept study in which participants were asked to agree or disagree with the statement, brace yourself, science has put it beyond reasonable doubt that COVID-19 is caused by a virus. The innovative part of their method is that both the email and the text were very short. Participants were just asked to click on a link and mark how much they agreed with the statement on a 5-point scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. According to the press release, this means that they have uncovered a new method to measure global scientific consensus. Finally,
So I think maybe on this point, there's quite a few points that have been raised, right? I think maybe the very first thing was kind of disparagingly talking about the people conducting the survey as being sociologists and philosophers. Now, I'm certainly very critical of philosophy, psychology, and the social sciences in some respects, but there's also a lot of legitimate philosophy, sociology, and psychology that's done where people are very concerned about good methods. And I don't know if you want to kind of comment on that point or any of the other points that are maybe more salient in your mind.
I can comment on this. I mean, there's a few things to say, but one is that originally when we came up with this idea that we would just present one statement, and I mean, I've been calling this a 10-second survey. The scientist gets a statement and they just have a Likert scale. So they read the statement and they vote. The reason we did that was we wanted this to potentially be something that could be ongoing indefinitely. So whenever there's a need to find out scientific community opinion about X, we can roll this out and there's a body there ready to respond. Whereas the traditional way of surveying is that surveys are much longer. So we looked at lots of other surveys that have been done, and lots have been done, for example, about climate change to try and show that there's a solid consensus that climate change is real and human caused. And there's quite a lot of papers on this. And a lot of the surveys there are like 9-10 pages long. And that really puts scientists off. So there's a low response rate, but also in terms of follow-ups, if you then try and follow up with new questions a month or two later that may have sprung up, you're going to get an even lower response rate. And then if you carry on again, within sort of 6 months to a year, you won't be getting any responses really, because there's survey fatigue. So we wanted this to potentially be something that could be ongoing, as I say. So we thought, let's just take up like less than 1 minute of scientists' time and see if that gives us a high response rate and also few opt-outs, and the possibility that this could be ongoing, really, potentially indefinitely. We did get some pushback from some sociologists, people who are familiar with doing survey work, saying that's just not how surveys are done. And, I think you could argue that we're kind of breaking the mold here, because surveys aren't done in this way, with one statement and a Likert scale. There are reasons why surveys are, typically 10 pages long. The first page is just, trying to get demographic information. So before you even get to the questions, there's all these other questions to fill in. So there's good reasons to do all of that, but we wanted to do this really quite different thing. And but we got some social scientists on board who were willing to who could see we were trying to do something really different, and could see that it had virtues, even though it had vices, compared with traditional ways of doing surveys. So that's just a bit of background there.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of things about Sabine's presentation here where, arguably you could say this is just sort of the style on YouTube or something, but I think, it's very negative right from the off, kind of before she's really justified any of the criticisms against the paper or kind of introduced her audience to the aims and goals. And I guess the second thing is her kind of first reason that she's providing to think that the paper's bad or doing something wrong is I get the sense that she's kind of like mockingly saying that this is progress or something, like, oh, this is supposed to be progress. But I think to the word she says is like, the novel part, but like it's implied that it's like the so-called novel part of this. And I think, there's a sense in which maybe from her point of view, she's like, for something to be considered legitimate science, it has to be, paradigm shifting, world breaking, or something like that. But there's a sense in which this is novel, that there's no existing facility or institution to measure things like this sort of consensus in an existing way that's kind of robust and tested from all these different angles and things, as I think you guys are trying to do. So while it might not be, a sort of new paradigm for physics or some AI that's going to revolutionize the economy or something, it's at least some kind of improvement in our knowledge base if we're concerned about these questions of what do people in certain fields or different demographics of specialists believe with respect to some question that there's a lot of disagreement about, I think. So it's not clear why she's like being so negative about that to me, or whether that's kind of appropriate, right?
Yeah, there were a couple of ways to look at what we've done. I was suggesting just before that what we were doing was sort of breaking the mold when it comes to surveying, because surveys haven't been done like this before. But if people just think we're going to survey scientists, find out what they think, and then say here's the truth, I guess. Well, one, that could seem naive, and two, it could seem like people have said in response to this video, people have already been surveying scientists, so there's nothing new here. I think the devil's in the details, and if you look at the specific way in which we're surveying, actually it is quite novel, and that's why we had some kickback originally with people saying that's not how you should survey people. And then we had to sort of explain why we were doing it in this way, and why, although you did lose something, you also gained something from this way of doing things. So it kind of depends on someone's background. To a certain kind of researcher, they'll see what we're doing as actually quite new, and potentially problematically so, because there's a reason why it was done the way it was before. So yeah, there's the point, of course, that there was more novelty to our approach than Sabine presents in the video. So, what she presents in the video does sound sort of silly, like, we haven't really done anything new except make the survey short. But yeah, maybe this is a good time to mention for anybody who's seen the video but not read the paper that the emails were coming from someone internal to each scientist's institution. So these were internal emails, which was a way to sort of build trust, really, and so that scientists weren't just getting a random external email from somebody they'd never heard of.
Right, because that's a concern I've seen in the comments section as well. It might be a little bit small, I'm not sure, but there were some comments where people were talking about thinking it might be, like this one, if I receive this email, I would assume that it's some kind of phishing scheme, right? That's been hearted by Sabine. So, maybe that's her staff or someone that's seen that, and I don't know, but it at least seems like an endorsement. But in the methodology, you're kind of setting things up to deliberately try and avoid that. And the high participation rate indicates that there's enough people who aren't considering it a phishing scheme, for it to still be useful and stuff.
Yeah, we had an interesting range of opinions. So some people, because scientists who participated often did get in touch. Some got in touch just to say this is a great idea. Some got in touch just to say instead that they would never click on a strange looking link in an email, whoever it came from. Right. Some even got in touch to say that they'd recently been, on some training at their institution, which told them they should never click on any. Anyway, other people got in touch with the person who'd sent the email, because as I say, this wasn't me. It was someone internal to that scientist's own institution in each case. So they'd got this internal email from somebody, maybe, down the road at their own institution. And they recognized it as an internal email, but they were still suspicious. So they emailed that person and said, did you really send me this? Is this a real project? And the person got back and said, yes, and gave them some explanation. And then they would participate. So, some people went through that extra stage of of making sure, if you like. But yeah, an interesting range of viewpoints on whether these emails were trustworthy or not.
That seems like an interesting thing independently to investigate, but it also struck.
Oh, you cut out, Lance. You might want to.
Yeah, that's been happening. It seems strange as an objection to doing the survey to say, these emails are suspicious. This would be true of any survey anybody sends out for anything in this manner. So it's the sort of thing that would just be applicable to in almost any context. So to present it as like a distinctive problem for this survey in particular seems a little strange, unless people are against surveying academics. I don't know what exactly the objection is supposed to be. But the other thing is that, this is something that really caught my attention when I was looking at the comments, which is that I get emails all the time, through my academic email, and we've become used to making judgments about does this look, there's some that are obviously spam or phishing, and we throw those out. Most of them are going to hit the spam folder. A lot of times, if they've been going around a lot, your department will notify you. Someone in the department will say, hey, there's this phishing scam. Watch out for emails coming that say that they're from this person. Third, it's pretty easy to check if you're not sure. So even if things are in that intermediate category, it's pretty easy to just email the person they're coming from or someone in the department and say, is this for real? And get a confirmation. And then fourth, it's not that hard to just look at them and judge which ones. Like, you look at what the email is. If it's coming from like xlgg2 at Yahoo or something, then you're not going to trust it. But I make these determinations all the time, and just by coincidence, I've done I think 2 surveys that were emailed to my academic account recently, and I looked at them and I was like, this looks legitimate. And it's very easy. I think you'd already mentioned this. You could just look up the project. So if it, normally if it's a legitimate thing, it'll say this is coming from this lab at this university. This is the PI on the whoever. You can just Google them, and it's pretty easy to find out if they're running that kind of thing. So a lot of people in the comments seem to be operating under the assumption that these emails would be suspicious in a way that would be unverifiable, and that this casts doubt on the study, because that would mean that the people that are clicking on the emails are like self-selecting into the population of ignorant, gullible people or something like that. And I see no particular reason to think that that's especially likely.
Okay, so if you want to say something about that, Peter, feel free. But otherwise,
only that. Yeah, I did see that explicitly in the comments, and like you say, there were quite a lot of comments. So we have to take this seriously. I wonder if it's just part of the AI revolution. People are just starting to think that literally anything, any email, however safe looking, now you should just be hugely skeptical about it. But yeah, I don't think we're quite there yet. I think these methods that academics just get used to for sifting through their emails and thinking about which ones are worth taking seriously, they still work. It's hard to see how they're going to stop working anytime soon. Like you say, Lance, you can Google a project and pretty quickly find out, I think, if it's a legitimate project. So, and in this case, that was very easy to do.
Right. So let's get into some more of the criticisms then. So
they prove that real progress still happens in science. But before I move on, let's appreciate for a moment the question they're asking. COVID-19 is, according to the World Health Organization, an infectious disease caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. If you don't trust the WHO, Wikipedia agrees. We literally have images of that virus. We know beyond any reasonable doubt that this virus exists, and COVID-19 is by definition whatever disease that virus causes. The only way you cannot agree with the statement that COVID-19 is caused by a virus is that you didn't understand the question.
So just to pause on this first objection, right, which is, it's almost like an analytic philosophy objection or something, right? Like, this is what the word means. And so the only way someone could disagree is to misunderstand. Do you want to comment about that? I mean, obviously I've got thoughts about it as well, but I mean, I'd rather probably more valuable to get your time while you're here.
I can say something straight away. So the actual statement that Sabine refers us to from the WHO website there, I'm not convinced that is saying that this is true by definition. They're certainly stating that the COVID-19 is caused by a virus. It's certainly not the case that everybody we surveyed thought that it was true by definition. Many thought it was trivially true, but only because of scientific evidence. So yeah, not analytic, so I feel like it's controversial to say that this is definitely true by definition. So yeah, there's an interesting scope thing going on here. So COVID-19 is an infectious disease. I mean, you might think that that's all they're saying here is that COVID-19 is an infectious disease, and it is caused. We know that it's caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That's one way to read it. The other way is that COVID-19 is, brackets by definition, an infectious disease caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. I don't know if you're sort of seeing that difference, but
yeah, no, I see that. I think what's going on as well is people presented with a series of symptoms, and I think the correct chronological order is then the medical community and the virology community attempt to sort of identify, well, what are the cause of these kind of symptoms that we're seeing, and so they then kind of attribute it to this entity, and there's a story there that I think is a true explanation. But I think that COVID-19 is used for the presentation of a set of symptoms that is, the best explanation of which is that it's caused by this virus. Or I mean, maybe that's too weird of a way of describing it as something, and maybe not most people in the medical community would provide different responses to that if you ask them or something. But I mean, that's something what I think is the right way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, we should also say that we were looking for a statement which was, we thought, obviously true.
Right.
We didn't want something that was tautologous. So I think we actually do disagree that it's true by definition. But still, we wanted to test out the methodology on a statement that we thought would get a really high consensus without something like something that was really ridiculous, the earth isn't flat, or I don't know, try to think of something that's even more obvious than this, because we wanted scientists to participate, and we thought that if the statement was really, really trivial, then they would think that the project was a waste of time. We didn't want to have to explain that we're just trying out the survey architecture here. So it was tricky trying to find a statement which was a scientific statement that we thought would get a really high consensus, but that wasn't too silly, if you like, for scientists to actually participate. So that was so we sort of debated what to survey for quite a while here. We didn't want it too much to hang on it. We could have maybe done smoking causes cancer or something, but we were looking for something that we thought would get a high consensus, partly to see how high a consensus we could get,
right,
with this particular methodology, given the noise in the signal, and which perhaps we'll get to a bit later.
Sure. I wanted
to mention something about that. This also immediately brought to mind for me when there's people that have been HIV deniers, that they'll deny that AIDS is caused by a HIV virus. And so there is this sort of conspiracy, scientific misinformation stuff out there where people have denied the established consensus on the connection between a particular set of symptoms and the virus or whatever other cause is behind it. And so this immediately brought to mind that linkage can be broken in people's minds. And it seems a bit strange to frame it as a definitional thing when you have examples like that.
And the last thing that she says here is that the only way for someone to disagree here is if they've misunderstood the question. I mean, I think she disagrees with that herself later on, because she says, people could just be trolling or whatever, is one reason why you might get a disagree response. But I suppose the other thing that would genuinely be interesting was if you got a lot of responses that were like disagree or strongly disagree to something that you initially thought was like a super uncontroversial statement of science. Well, maybe that would be like actually some pretty good evidence that something was off about your understanding of either with respect to COVID or its cause, or the way that scientists think about the causation in this case, or what they mean by the terms. It doesn't self-interpret as to why you got that kind of like disparity between what you expected. But I would actually consider that, for me as someone who's not like a specialist in the field, be like, oh wow, like I didn't expect that. Now I should really find out what these people think on that or something.
Yeah, just to come in on this, in the paper we do discuss all the reasons why we didn't get 100% or even higher than what we got, 93.8%, I think it was. And there's quite a few reasons that we identify, and the ones that Sabine mentions are I think real reasons, but there are others. I mean, one scientist got in touch to say that they disagree. They felt like they needed to get in touch to explain it. I mean, it was nice that some scientists got in touch to do this. And they said, look, it's because I think that COVID-19 is triggered by a virus, but the cause, there's lots of other causal factors to do with one's genes, immune system, whatever. You can imagine how that goes. So that was a case where somebody wanted to sort of pick at the statement and say, well, what do we really mean by caused? And there was some other cases where scientists had a philosophy, which I think is based in Karl Popper's work, potentially, who's still influential in some scientific circles, that nothing in science is beyond reasonable doubt. And the idea is that you should be open-minded about literally everything. And that's an important philosophy for scientists to have, which was also interesting. But for them, it wasn't about COVID-19 and its cause and its cause. It was more about this statement, beyond reasonable doubt, and what makes a scientist a good scientist. And they just value being open-minded really, really highly. So that clause was one of the reasons some people voted disagree.
Awesome. Right. So let's carry on then with some more objections.
Attributed to COVID-19 are caused by a virus, but that's not what they asked. That said, what do you think the responses looked like? The researchers invited over 20,000 scientists from various disciplines from 12 countries and got about 7,000 replies. 93.2% agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that COVID-19 is caused by a virus. The fraction does not depend a whole lot on the respondents' area of expertise. They think that this study was a great success, and according to the press release, following the success of the pilot, the team has expanded the network to 80 institutions, incorporating 50,000 scientists worldwide, and the research team aims to make this tool a regular feature of global science communication, helping inform society on critical scientific issues affecting all of us. This is about the last thing the world needs. What this pilot study documents is that about 7% of the respondents either didn't understand the question, were trolling, or both. But science deniers all over the world can now go and say that 7% of all scientists don't even agree that COVID is caused by a virus, which, I remind you, is true by definition. It paints.
So to pause on that point then, so like Sabine's kind of got this concern that this sort of study could act as ammunition for people who have these like wrong, heterodox or socially harmful views or something. Because it would be some kind of like vindication that there is, a scientific dispute about what whether COVID-19 is caused by a virus or something. Now, I think in order for that to go through, you need some assumptions in the background about, well, where the threshold is for like a consensus to be like strong evidence against a position. So in Sabine's view, it seems to be like, was it 93.7% or something around that, where it is not high enough as a number for like, to be like an overwhelming consensus. maybe at this point you couldn't really say that if you haven't asked a lot of these questions. Maybe you'd have to ask everyone 1 + 1 = 2 or something and see what you get, and like that, well, that's as strong as we're ever going to get or something, and or have a range of different questions and say, here's the kind of spread of responses, and this looks like a really strong. But I mean, yeah, what are your thoughts on this kind of train of objection?
Yeah, I mean, I can see where she's coming from. So I did have an email discussion with somebody who had run a survey about anthropogenic climate change, and their result was, I think, 97%. There's a Wikipedia page called Scientific Consensus on Climate Change, and it sort of suggests, more or less, looking at a few different studies, that there's about a 97% consensus. And so in this email exchange, this scientist was worried that if we ran a consensus on the same topic, basically on the same question, and we got a lower result, that would hit the headlines for something like scientists aren't as sure as they used to be,
right,
that climate change is human caused. And of course, what we really want to say, and we discuss this in the paper, is that so much depends on the specific question you ask and the specific way you ask it. And also whether you ask, if you like, highly relevant scientists, or if you go a bit broader and just ask broadly relevant scientists. And there's even a paper that suggests that the consensus on climate change is 100%. But in that case, I mean, there were ways to get 100% result on climate change. For example, you could just ask IPCC authors and say that they are the true experts. But of course, then most of those authors have gone into the IPCC because they want to fight climate change. So it's a pretty safe group. So there were all of these sort of decision points along the way, which do affect the final result. I mean, this is potentially, I think, an interesting result of our research, that maybe one thing we can show is that the final, if you like, consensus score you get at the end depends on a range of decision points, and if you want to get a high score, then you'll make certain choices, and if you've got an agenda, and if you wanted to get a lower score, then that you could make those choices differently. You could ask a slightly different question in a slightly different way to a different group of scientists. So if that's a result that we get out, then I think it's interesting and important, because it can show sort of preemptively, if you like, that if science deniers run a survey, then they're going to bias it in a certain way because they've got an agenda. They want to show that the consensus on climate change isn't 97%, it's lower. But it depends on something tricky here, which is the psychology of the general public, really, whether they are going to sort of accept this result, that the result you get out of a survey like this depends on certain decisions you make, and you have to be super careful about examining those decisions in case the people running the survey have an agenda.
Yeah. So I've seen like there's these lists of I think it's like people who reject evolution by common descent or something, right? That I forget which. It's one of these, like one of these young Earth creationist ministries or something has this like big document with, I don't know, 250 people with doctor in front of their name, and a lot of them are like, mechanical engineers or things like that. Like it's not really clear what their doctorate has to do with expertise pertaining to kind of like evolution by common descent or anything. But the point is that you can kind of gerrymander the responses that you get by selecting the kind of reference class that you choose for your questionnaires. But I guess maybe part of the idea that, tell me if this is right or wrong, part of the idea that you're trying to do in setting up something like this network is to have like a very transparent, like independent institution in some sense that people can trust, because it won't have biases, or it'll try to mitigate any biases that are implicit in the questionnaire from or in selection effects from only giving it to certain institutions or something. Is that sort of right broadly?
Yeah, I think that was dissentfromdarwinism.org or something. I've had a look at that. Yeah, they have more than 1,000 signatures on it, but like you say, they don't care if people are experts in any sense. I think we would want this to be. I mean, yeah, of course it would be transparent, and you'd be able to sort of see the way it had been done. In this case, votes were tagged with information, and one of the things was the field of the scientist. Now, we just chose like physicist, chemist, biologist, earth scientist, and health scientist. And the idea really was that the health scientist results would probably be the relevant ones, but the others would be interesting to see. What we actually got, as Sabine mentions in a video, is that the result wasn't really affected by field. I mean, most scientists have a pretty clear view on COVID and what's caused it. So physicists, did feel like they could vote and that they had an opinion to give on this that was a sound opinion. So maybe that's why we didn't get really a different result from health scientists. But there's the possibility here of carving up the relevant group of experts in different ways. So instead of health scientists, we could have chosen to go more fine-grained and have like virologists or whatever you feel is more relevant, and then sort of see the differences there. So maybe you could see if virologists specifically have respond differently to other areas of expertise, like health scientists more broadly. So these are some of the decision points, how you choose who to ask. And I don't think there's one objective right way to carve up the relevant experts, but in this first pilot project, we decided just do it broadly as health scientists. But then we added on these other categories to see if that made a difference in this particular case as well, so that we could say, look, we thought we'd be able to say at the end, it doesn't matter if you ask health scientists or if you ask all scientists, there's a solid consensus about this. And in some cases, like maybe climate change as well, you could get that result. You could say, look, it doesn't matter if you ask, the absolute experts, the experts, or just all scientists, you always get a solid consensus that, climate change is human caused or whatever, you can ask whatever you like, but, we thought it would be interesting to get that kind of data. So yeah, how we do that in the future, I mean, there's lots of options here, and it's something that needs research really. It's very tricky to get it right, I think, because like I said, even in the case of climate change, if you ask the really core experts, then there is a worry that they are the ones who are obviously going to be pro climate change, and so they feel like a biased group, even though in a sense they are the top experts on climate change. So there were tricky decisions to make.
Yeah, I guess like there are limitations to what these sorts of consensus data can show, because you could still explain the consensus through like a different mechanism than, it simply being the result of scientific inquiry or something. You say like there's really strong social pressures, or there's like, I don't know, manufactured consent by an evil cabal of pharmaceutical companies or something. Now, I'm not suggesting that at all in these cases, but I mean, those would still be like ways of explaining the data if there was consent, I guess. And you've got to maybe try and conduct this in a way where you try to enrich the data that you've got with any kind of indicators of those things, if you could, which is hard to do because you're trying to do this very simple like study thing where you just ask a single question, right, as well, to get the high response rate.
Yeah, I mean, one thing just to mention on this is that we wanted to wash out biases, and one way you can wash out biases is to ask a really large group, so that within that group you're going to get people of all different career stages, people of all different backgrounds, people who have all different political views, And then if despite all of those differences, you still get a strong consensus, that seems like evidence that actually that consensus exists because the scientific evidence is just really strong. So it doesn't matter what your background is or what your politics are, you still end up believing something. So that's like a tool you can try and use, washing out biases just by having a large sample size and large response rate. So that was one reason we did that.
Great. Let's continue on then.
Is caused by a virus, which I remind you is true by definition. It pains me especially that this nutty idea comes from philosophers and sociologists who should really know better. Philosophically, science is not done by consensus, it's done by argument. There's no better story to illustrate this than that of Albert Einstein's reaction when in 1931 a book was published with the title 100 Authors Against Einstein that supposedly showed that Einstein's theory of relativity was wrong. What did he say? If I were wrong, it would only take one. In science, it doesn't matter what your opinion is if you have no evidence and no argument to support it. It doesn't matter how many people agree with you. It doesn't matter if there's some poll to back you up. It doesn't matter how many subscribers you have on YouTube. The only thing that matters is whether you have a good argument. That's why the IPCC does not write their reports by consensus mechanism.
Or maybe I'll pause on the previous point then. So I guess the general idea here is that, there's this informal fallacy of appealing to popularity. Popularity of an idea isn't, relevant to its truth. And so we should just focus on the truth, right? And I think Sabine's like kind of driving this wedge between the idea of there being a consensus on the one hand and like true. I don't exactly know what she'd say, like true, she said arguments and evidence, like true arguments and evidence on the other hand, which is sort of, divorced from the consensus of what the scientific community believe. So I guess if she's right, then maybe that undermines the validity of this project as a measure or as having any relevance to what we should believe about science, or something like that. So what do you think about that?
I mean, this is something I do argue in my book quite extensively, is that consensus in science is hard won. Scientists are usually skeptics at heart. They don't follow the crowd just because they've been told to. I mean, maybe some do, or but usually a consensus in science is hard won. And by consensus, I mean, another thing we should mention is this is ambiguous. Some people think consensus means everyone. In that case, there's no consensus in science about anything, I think, and Sabine even suggests that's how she's using the word consensus a little later on in the video, if there's just one person is always going to disagree, as if that doesn't mean it's a consensus anymore. But yeah, we don't think that 70% is should count as a consensus, and I think one thing we can do here is not actually say when it counts as a consensus, but we can just present the results and let people make up their own mind. So there's something that's like strong majority, if you like, but how you interpret the results is something that we don't necessarily have to do ourselves. I mean, we could make some suggestions, but we could also just say, look, here's the results, and leave them out there and let people make their own minds up about them. So yeah, I'm not even sure that Sabine and I were sort of using the word consensus in the same way.
Right. Yeah, Lance, go ahead.
Yeah, I was hoping you could perhaps elaborate on or clarify something, because when I hear her say these things, and when I look at the comments for this video, I have the impression that people may be thinking something like this, and it's because they're saying stuff like, well, science isn't a democracy. It looks like they may be thinking something like that there's this very simple causal relation between scientific consensus, or like if scientists think something, that somehow makes it true, almost like we're some kind of weird cultural truth relativists, where if a bunch of scientists think something, that is what itself makes it true, rather than it being that we're getting data on what scientists think is true because of the arguments and the evidence, which is what she points to. It all depends on a good argument. Yeah, well, if thousands of people semi-independently arrive at similar conclusions about the quality of the arguments and evidence, then you survey those people and they happen to agree with one another. That's what I would take the consensus to be. The consensus is sitting on top of all the arguments and evidence being independently evaluated by a bunch of different people with expertise. And that's why the consensus matters. At least that's how I would take it. But I'm curious how you would take it, and whether you think that what might be going on is like this more direct relation that people think, like this weird relativist notion.
Yeah, I have to say, in philosophy, it's not that common, or even in sociology, it's not common to find somebody who has that extreme view that a scientific fact is just what scientists happen to believe right now. So I do know of one paper where somebody says this, and so in that view, there are scientific facts now, but they won't be the scientific facts of the future. And there were scientific facts in the past that we no longer believe, and it's just what the scientific community believe. But this is quite extreme, I think, in philosophy of science and even in sociology, because it falls to. There are obvious challenges. So, for example, smoking causes cancer. Well, if you press somebody to sort of say, well, that's just true for now, and in 50 years, we'll all be looking back saying, oh, that was a fact then, but no one believes it now. That seems, most people find that quite an uncomfortable position. And if smoking causing cancer isn't a good enough example, think of any example which science has established. One of my favorites is just that dinosaurs did exist. It's not just a theory. So that's something that we didn't used to know. Scientists established it through evidence over decades or even centuries. Gradually, and it became in the end something that we don't call it a theory anymore. It's just a fact that dinosaurs existed. But according to this view, it would have to be that, oh, that's only true for now. I think that it is quite extreme for someone to say that scientists can just believe something en masse as a really solid scientific consensus when the evidence isn't that strong. So that one thing that I do in my book, and I don't want to keep talking about the book, but there's lots of information in there, is goes through examples from the history of science where scientists thought they knew something and then they were wrong. And the reason I look at these cases is because we want to know, how there are lessons to learn from these cases. Like, there have been cases where science. So, for one good example, is that scientists, or most scientists, thought for a while that it was impossible for continents to drift. And there was a really strong view about this. I wouldn't say that there was a solid international scientific consensus, because it was a very strong view in North America, for example, but not in South Africa. And it was a strong view in paleontology, but not in some other fields. So, the reason we should look at these cases is to sort of see how strong a consensus can there be, and what are the red flags that maybe it doesn't it doesn't reveal a truth. And one red flag is that not people in different countries disagree, or people in different fields disagree, or that there isn't actually a stronger consensus as we thought. It's only like 80% or something. So I think, generally speaking, despite these sort of historical lessons about scientists thinking something and then being wrong, there are cases like that. But generally speaking, I think we can make this connection between scientific evidence and good scientific arguments and weight of scientific community opinion. So, yeah, that's something not everyone will agree on. I suppose the less you agree with that, the more you'll think that it's not worth finding out scientific community opinion, because you'll think that, well, the minority view is often right and the majority view is often wrong. I mean, if you think that, then you might think that, why do I want to know scientific community opinion, maybe? Whereas if you think that there is sort of a correlation there. Most of the time, if there's a large majority view, it means that the evidence and the arguments are strong. And if there's a minority view, most of the time it means that there isn't much evidence, or the arguments aren't that strong or persuasive. And that is where I'm coming from personally.
I guess the sort of idea here, right, would be that this kind of consensus data, it's not kind of like the final thing that'll settle what the truth is or something, but it's some evidence, right? So like if you take the case of Sabine as a theoretical physicist, well, yeah, if she gets some survey data that says a lot of theoretical physicists disagree with her, but she, has all of these like reasons from her area of research that she's aware of, well, then the evidence and reasons that she have is going to kind of like, she's going to have a good explanation of why she thinks those physicists are wrong, which she's talked about in other videos in terms of like the incentive structures that are there in physics and how she thinks, people are lost in the mathematical equations and things like that. So for her, like, while that consensus evidence might be some very weak evidence that she's wrong or something, it's not, she's still overall going to believe that the consensus doesn't reflect the truth of something. But then if you take a different subject, one that, you're not a specialist in, well, you just may not even have the relevant expertise to assess the information, right? You might not be able to read all of the literature, there might be special types of equations involved or special skills that you just don't understand or have access to, or even, like funding things, right? It might be the case that you can't access journals or the really expensive textbooks and things that are around. So in those cases, then consensus might be something that's really valuable as evidence for you as a non-specialist or someone without relevant expertise to get a sense of what you should believe. Again, maybe you shouldn't think, oh yeah, this is absolute truth for all of time and no one could give me any reasons that would change my mind or anything like that. But I mean, if you're kind of in a state of ignorance, that's going to be pretty good, as opposed to, I don't know, maybe trying to just read one really controversial paper or something to get a sense of the whole subject and what that might be actually better evidence to something like that in that case. But it's going to really be context dependent on the evidence someone has, I think.
We should mention Thomas Kuhn and the theory of paradigm shifts, because that his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, was hugely influential, not only for philosophers but also for scientists. And according to that idea, there have been these paradigm shifts, and there will be future ones. And within a specific paradigm, there are facts and known things and known ways of assessing evidence. But in a future paradigm, there'll be different facts and different ways of assessing evidence. Now, one of the things that's in the literature that I know is the idea that the biggest scientific revolutions, and the ones that Thomas Kuhn really uses to make his case, are from theoretical physics, like the quantum revolution and relativity. And obviously, all of the lessons that have come with quantum paradoxes, interpretations of quantum mechanics, black holes, and so on. The theoretical physics is a space where we actually expect big revolutions, I think, in the future. We know that there's a problem with meshing together quantum theory and general relativity. So something has to change. There are big mysteries in that area. So maybe if you're working in that area, you would expect that really nothing should be closed off, because we know there's going to be big changes, and you should be literally open-minded about anything, including things that are hugely unintuitive, like many worlds, or ideas about causation or the passage of time and so on. But in most other scientific fields, it's not like that. There are things that we know about, sugars and fats and proteins and how they work inside the human body, for example. And no one's expecting an earth-shattering paradigm shift there. Instead, there's sort of secure knowledge about what these kinds of molecules are doing and how they work, and also geology as well. And lots that we know about the history of planet Earth. Anyway, that was all just to say that I think maybe Sabine's field of expertise, her field of specialism, does lead to a worry about revolutions or revolutionary ideas that doesn't exist to the same degree in other fields.
Right. And then I think maybe that has some bearing on the example that she used of Einstein in the 100 letters. And I think in some sense what she's saying is right. Like insofar as the 100 people in the letter who are kind of like saying here's why Einstein's wrong are a representative sample of the community of physicists. I have no idea if they are or not at the time, but if you grant that, maybe this is a good counterexample to like consensus being correct or something like that. However, I still think that the story is sort of a bit more complicated than Sabine kind of like alludes to, right? Where she says like the evidence just stands on its own merit. It's like there's kind of a set of rival theories, and the evidential base that those physicists may have had at the time might not have been good enough to kind of just to warrant their belief in something like Einstein's equations. Now maybe they shouldn't have been super dismissive or something. If they were, they should have had, been kind of like open to being wrong or something like that, or really looking forward to getting more data that might kind of like help discriminate between one theory and another one. And then it wasn't until we got that extra data that consensus in physics kind of shifted. And I think that that's not a result of arguably it's partly a result of there being like problems in physics and are not having like complete set of data and stuff, but it's also evidentially like warranted that people should have done that at the time, because we had to like gather more data for then people's beliefs to change over time. And so I guess that the point that I'm making in a convoluted way is that there's quite a complicated story of what the right thing is to do with our beliefs and the evidence that we have that isn't always going to be perfect as well, and will sometimes lead scientists to having like a consensus that's wrong. But the reason that consensus is valuable is because what we've done in the various scientific disciplines and institutions that we have is construct these like overall mechanisms and methods that are supposed to kind of like chip away at these things over time. So even if there's periods where we believe untrue things or where we've not got a complete picture, the idea is that this is our best set at kind of modifying and changing that over time to get the best picture of things, even if it's not always going to be perfect or something, right? So I think there's something wrong with the analogy that Sabine is using, or something right and something wrong with it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be careful about where these claims are coming from. You already mentioned the descent from Darwin. It's sort of a ganging up, really, or at least a selection. The people who have signed that letter, they've signed it. They've been selected really from people who don't agree with it. There isn't a separate letter for them. They just don't sign it. So everyone who signed it, of course, is self-selected there. So yeah, that's one reason that we wanted to have these really large surveys to sort of get the widest possible spectrum of opinion, and then if there's still a consensus after that, or even like just a large majority, then there's probably a good reason for that. Although like we said, there were these lessons from history which we have to take into account, and we don't want this to find out there's 85% of scientists think X, and therefore all funders should never fund anything that goes against that. But I don't think funders are actually they're really thoughtful about these things. I've talked to some funders. They do want to fund at least some projects that are a little bit more high risk but potentially higher reward. Ideas that are a little bit heterodox, perhaps, maybe not wildly heterodox, but they're not following the orthodoxy. I think funders, generally speaking, are open to funding that kind of project. And I have to add as well that some of these projects that explore heterodox ideas, they're not going to just be complete failures as project if the heterodox idea is wrong. The funders would expect to see a project that will make incremental progress in interesting ways, even if the idea that's being explored is actually not correct in the end. I mean, you know, projects have lots of objectives and aims. So funders will take that into account. So I don't think that, you know, that we need to worry about, you know, we conduct a survey, there's 85-90% result, and then funders just look at that and think we're not going to fund anything else from now on.
Yeah. Right. Let's play on a little bit of the video then, see
YouTube. The only thing that matters is whether you have a good argument. That's why the IPCC does not write their reports by consensus mechanism. It's not how science works. What they do, or at least try to do, is to go through all scientific claims and look at the evidence for them. Yes, the IPCC process has problems, but at least it's not consensus-based. And sociologically,
So I think just on that point, I mean, again, there's a sense in which she's right and wrong here, which is that there is basically what's happening there is you're creating, you know, a kind of collection of experts, and you're getting them to assess the evidence and arguments, and amongst themselves establish what like consensus is there, right? So it's sort of still, it's not like consensus is playing no role in the IPCC example that she's using as a counterexample there, I don't think.
There's actually this thing called the uncertainty framework in the IPCC reports, which is used, and it has these two axes. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it has one for evidence and one for agreement. And the agreement axis is reasonably interpreted as an axis measuring the extent of agreement, or perhaps consensus if the agreement is high enough. And the idea behind that is that it's a scale of confidence. I can present this. Maybe that's useful. But when the evidence score is really high and the agreement score is really high, then that's high confidence. And when they're both low, that gives us low confidence. So when you look at these IPCC documents and you find in brackets, high confidence, medium confidence, or low confidence, they've used this uncertainty framework, which actually does use consensus.
Right.
So that's actually something we do have another paper coming out, and we talk about it there, and we actually present this uncertainty framework as one of our figures. So I agree with her. Like you say, there's something right about what she's saying. The IPCC doesn't just go around polling scientists and saying this is what we should believe. But it does play a role.
Yeah.
Problem is that the poll results impact the scientific community. This shouldn't happen because scientists should all have training to prevent social biases, but unfortunately they don't. So most will adjust their opinion to fit the supposed consensus, and that'll streamline the scientific community even more than is already the case. What we should do is create an institution that collects and evaluates scientific evidence and gives out confidence values based on evidence. But constantly evaluating the scientific consensus is an overall horrible idea, because
So just to pause on that point then. So there was sort of like two worries. One was that it'll have this kind of socialization effect or something, like of exerting a pressure on scientists to conform to that opinion rather than to maybe explore different ideas that might turn out to be true but are not currently the consensus. I mean, do you have any sort of thoughts about that?
There's some fantastic examples from history where we can see how this has happened. Basically, there is an effect where scientists can be moved to believe something based for sociological reasons. So an interesting example is one I've already mentioned, that's continental drift. So especially in North America, young geologists and paleontologists were brought up in this environment where it was quote unquote known that continents couldn't drift. It was just like a law of physics. So that it was a silly idea. And some of those scientists, or many of those scientists growing up, just did take that on faith because it was being taught to them, during their academic formation. not all, but some. So, there is an effect there. The question is how powerful it is. If it was so powerful that, once something starts to get traction, basically everyone jumps on the bandwagon, and before you know it, there's 100% consensus, then that would be hugely worrying. But that's not the case. I think we can see that historically with some of these examples, where although some scientists get on board with an idea just because it's the fashion of the time and senior scientists are saying it's definitely correct, not all do. Many scientists are critical thinkers. They want to look at the evidence for themselves. They're not going to believe something just because one of the top scientists in their field is saying it's true. So it's interesting to explore this dynamic. And I think the main thing to say is that it does exist, but it's not as strong as some people fear it might be.
And then I think the second point that was raised was something like, instead of doing that, what we should be doing is just like kind of presenting what the data says in with like confidence intervals by like looking at all the data. I guess my initial impression of that is I'm not even exactly sure what the claim is, just because from my point of view, like data isn't like self-interpreting or something. So, insofar as you sort of have one mechanism for doing this, whether it's like, I don't know, some kind of big database or something, well, then you're just going to be doing the interpreting across all the data in quotes. And then there's only so much that you can even ever hope to access or kind of like, process in order to sort of like form an overall opinion of what's going on. Or insofar as it's like one person, then it's just going to be like that one person's interpretation of the data and the same problems in place, and they're telling you. So I think that in terms of what science is as an institution, is it's all the data in quotes, and then like a whole bunch of individuals in institutions with their views on the data, their interpretations and mechanisms for sort of like, fleshing that out. And there's a bunch of legitimate criticisms of that, but then the correct like level of interrogation to find out what's like, what's the best guess at the answer to some question in that system is to ask all the scientists, I think, in that view. Like that's the best way I think of getting at that, because you're getting all the different interpretations on large sets of the data. Whereas the kind of alternatives, I'm not sure exactly what they're supposed to be, and they seem to have like bigger problems. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, though.
Yeah, I mean, there are different ways to do these things. I think consensus is always going to play some role, even if all you want to do is pick 10 of the top's leading experts who work exactly in that area and see if they all agree. And you might think that's the way to do it. We don't care what 10,000 other scientists who broadly work in that area think. If those 10 agree, then it must be correct. So that's one way in which to sort of, if you like, still in a sense agree that consensus matters, but only amongst the really top few individuals. I think what we wanted to do with the study is, I mean, that kind of thing already happens, because it's relatively speaking, I think it's easier to see if the top 5 or 10 people in a field agree, rather than asking 20,000 or something. But we thought that so we didn't want to do away with that, because I think that's a legitimate and interesting thing to do. But we wanted to provide, if you like, something that complements that by looking to see what a broader scientific community thinks. The thing that there were, I mean, this is something that we do discuss a bit, the pros and cons. I think the pros and cons to both, and I think ideally we want both.
Right.
And then we can, if they disagree, if for example, if you look, the 10 top experts all agree, but actually the consensus on the broader scientific community is only 80%, then that's something you can then ask why, and maybe do some follow-up studies to see see what that means. Does it mean anything? There's, why did those 10 agree? Could there well, which do we want to take more seriously? You know, is consensus 100% because those 10 agreed with each other, or is it 80%? It's just it's an interesting data point that we can then follow up on. I don't think we should jump to any conclusions.
Mm-hmm. Right, almost towards the end of the video, so let's see. We've got a good commentary to review ratio going on the video. Almost just over an hour on our review, but 5 minutes of videos.
The end of the day, no matter how many scientists you poll, you'll always find at least one who misunderstands the question, one who just likes annoying sociologists, and one who answers C on a scale from 1 to 5. I don't like to waste my time, so I'm constantly looking for ways.
So just on that point, then the worry is that there will be like confounds in the data. How do you control for these confounds, I guess? So yeah, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed this quite a bit in the paper, and it's under the heading of noise, really. So suppose it is the case that 100% of scientists agree, and then you run a survey. Well, you might not get 100% in your survey for certain reasons. And so there's a gap between the actual agreement in the scientific community and what your data gives you. And scientists are used to this because, you know, there's lots of ways to measure the speed of light, and you might know what the speed of light actually is, but then because there's noise in your signal for whatever reason, you know, you're not going to get it exactly bang on. And in this case, I think Sabina's right that, you know, there were always going to be people who misread the question. In fact, one person got in touch to say they'd accidentally hit the wrong end of the Likert scale and changed their view. We couldn't change their view because you know, it was genuinely completely anonymous. So we had no way to tell which vote had come from this scientist. Or even if they were telling the truth. So we had to leave that as just part of the noise. Now, there must be other scientists who did that but didn't realize it, so they didn't get in touch with us. And then there are going to be some who were just sort of, they like being contrary, and I think that's important in science. And yeah, some who just want to annoy sociologists, maybe, although most of those hopefully would just delete the email. And then there's going to be a lot, I think, that we're going to pick neutral, you know, C on a scale of 1 to 5, as Sabine puts it. And that's sort of you know, this I think comes under the heading of what's known as satisficing, where it's sort of a safe vote to make. You can't be wrong if you're neutral. Allegedly, you know, that's a good way to be a scientist, to stay neutral, and to, you know, it can be considered a virtue because, you know, you're not taking a side, you're just being open to both sides. So quite a lot of scientists, I think, will hit neutral in surveys like this. You don't really have to think about the question much. You just think, right, I'm just going to be neutral. You know, I don't have to really think what do I believe. So she's right that a lot will hit neutral. So the thought there is that, you know, you have to factor these things in and think, if we get 95% in our results, well, that's lower than the actual consensus probably, because you know, there's people who have well, there's noise in the signal, if you like. Or if you don't think it's lower, at least, you know, you can say that it's the consensus is 95% give or take, and you just have error bars there. So, you know, yeah.
So Lance, I don't know if you want to come in on this and say something as well, just about like, do you think that this is a big enough problem with survey data that it sort of undermines any effects that we might find in survey data? And, you know, is there like a sense of how much of an effect these like confounding things might have on the data, and how can we handle them better in kind of any post hoc analysis we do?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's enough to undermine, you know, the reliability or the value of survey data, to point out, you know, that there could be people that are trolling or unserious when they respond or misunderstand the question, or there's a variety of other factors that one could throw in the bucket of noise in.
Oh, there you go. You're back.
Yeah, this is an ineliminable feature of virtually any surveys that you conduct, and the degree of noisiness is going to heavily depend on a whole bunch of factors that are going to vary from one survey context to another. The kind of question you ask, how you ask the question, what kind of response options you provide to people, who you're asking, how you're asking, all of these factors are going to contribute. I don't know if you've seen this. Some people may or may not be aware of this, but it's something on that Scott Alexander, from Slate Star Codex, now Astro Codex 10, is talking about the lizard man constant. And this is that, if you survey the American public, you'll always get this small percentage of people, maybe 3 or 4%, that will say that they believe that there's like a conspiracy of lizard aliens to take over the world. They're overthrowing the government. Now, there probably are some people that believe something like that or something adjacent to that, but you do occasionally have people that just want to be a little cheeky when they're filling out a survey. And if you give people the option to choose something silly, like, I am literally a tuna sandwich or something like that, some people will, if you survey the entire population of the United States, you would get a few people that would choose that they're a tuna sandwich. And of course they're not, and they probably don't think that they are, but they would choose that anyway. This noise is just one of the things that you have to deal with when you're dealing with surveys. But noise is going to be a factor in virtually any social scientific research, especially because, unlike, and look, I'm not a physicist or a chemist. I don't know exactly the specific distinctive challenges that they face in those fields, but in psychology, pretty much any data you gather is going to be, I would say not pretty much, any data you gather is going to be, to one extent or another, behavioral data. And that I would classify responses to questions as a type of behavior. And that a lot of that is going to require some type of interpretation. So I have to interpret people's behavior if I'm directly observing behavior, seeing if someone is going to be pro-social or not, or I have to interpret a person's survey responses, and that requires some assumptions about how I'm operationalizing the questions I'm asking and all those sorts of things. Because in most of those survey contexts, things are mediated through language, ambiguity is always going to be a factor, and attention is going to be a factor. Sometimes a person just not paying that much attention, they click the wrong button. So, performance errors and all those sorts of things, those are a problem that we always face in all research. If someone were to say that that's sufficient to challenge this particular study, it would seem to raise serious questions about the legitimacy of all social scientific research, or at least a significant majority of it, or at least a significant majority of surveys. I don't think that would be reasonable. And I say that in spite of, I wrote my whole dissertation critiquing the methods used in an entire field where I'm like, these surveys are all invalid in this area of research. So I say this coming from a background of being extremely critical of ambiguity, misleading instructions in surveys. I say this as someone that critiqued a bunch of studies for these problems. So I'm not saying this as someone that is hyper defensive of surveys and wants to say just blindly trust research. I'm coming from a perspective of there are a lot of serious problems, but a little bit of noise is not an insurmountable problem. It's the sort of thing where we just understand that if we're talking about trying to make some estimate of the true proportion of people that believe something or do something or are a certain way in a population, that we're working within some type of margin of error. We've got confidence intervals around some mean, and we may not know the exact number, but you don't need that level of precision to make meaningful policy decisions or to make practical judgments of considerable value in the sciences. And this would be true in many, many scientific contexts. The level of precision may be substantially lower than you would get in physics, and that may be unfortunate. But fortunately, we're not trying to land, a probe somewhere where if we're off by a meter, it's going to be a disaster, because we're not going to hit that level of precision in the social sciences. And that's one of the challenges. But it's also not like we're not aware of this, that we don't factor this in, that this isn't a matter of constant ongoing evaluation. And it's not like it wasn't social scientists themselves that have drawn attention to these problems and have done their best to mitigate it. So, sometimes when people criticize the social sciences for having these difficulties, it almost seems as though they think that social scientists are a bunch of naive idiots that are not aware of the challenges when they are the ones that identify, work on it, and attempt to mitigate the challenges, myself included.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that.
I think Sabine's criticism here would have been better, because she actually says, well, there's always going to be one who doesn't doesn't read the question properly, one who's like mischievous, and one who answers C. She might have had a better criticism if she'd said there's going to be like between 0 and 5% who don't read it properly, 0 and 5% who are mischievous, and 0 and 5% who hit C, and we don't know where. We've got no idea where between 0 and 5%. I mean, I think that would have been a better challenge, because as Lance was saying, then her point would have been that the error bars are huge, so then it becomes less helpful. I don't think that would have been a fair criticism, but I think it would have been better than what she says.
Yeah, that actually is very similar to the kind of criticism I've made in my own work of a very particular literature, where I basically say it's like death by a thousand cuts. It's like this particular issue introduces noise, this particular issue, but I raise like 30 issues or something approaching them for this particular literature, to where it becomes plausible that those error bars are going to be so huge that particular data set is unreliable. I don't see any particular reason to think that's true in this case. And what is especially striking to me is that some of the criticisms of this particular survey seemed to underestimate just how remarkably well it appears to perform on a variety of metrics, like the overall response rate. So if someone was concerned with, for instance, representativeness or selection effects from unrepresented people responding to the survey, there's various levels at which that occurs. It actually does better than most surveys. So if again, I'm concerned about people singling out this particular survey because other surveys do worse. Do they think that we shouldn't trust any of those surveys? And if that's the case, I'd really be curious about what's going on with people being wildly skeptical of a wide range of survey data, if in fact they were consistent in that regard, and what that's predicated on. So, like someone with a background like mine, I have a lot more direct knowledge of what goes on in surveys and what problems there might be. But a lot of the people that are like in the comment section, for instance, it's not likely that they actually have as much knowledge about the issues of surveys. A lot of it instead seems to be predicated on what look like anxieties about or concerns about leveraging the results of surveys for like propagandistic or reasons to enforce some sort of scientific consensus, and less so on substantive methodological critiques.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up just briefly, I think you're right that there's a worry about an authoritarian agenda where you run a survey, you show there's a consensus on some matter, and then you sort of dictate to people that you must believe this or something like that, or at least you go to the policymakers and say you must act in line with this because the community has spoken. So I think potentially there's a worry that there's some problematic agenda behind this, rather than the idea of just in an unbiased way, just presenting in a clearer way than we've had before scientific community opinion, and which is really what we were trying to do.
Great. So let's see. I don't know if there's one or two more points from Sabine, so let's go through.
To learn more efficiently, not just faster, but also so that I remember it better. I've recently begun using this app called...
I think I'm just advertising, at that point. So I think that's it. Maybe I was wrong.
And yes, of course, I have a special offer. First...
so I think that's it in terms of the criticism. So, that's the paper. Is there anything else that you feel it would be sort of like helpful to communicate about the paper that you think is kind of like missed in the responses of the criticisms that we've gone over, or anything about this overall project that would be like useful to communicate here?
I don't think there's with respect to Sabine, I don't think there are serious criticisms or worries there. She does state at one point that if we present some of these results, they'll be misinterpreted by journalists, by the public, and there'll be damaging consequences. So this is something that's come up a few times in discussion with people, that not all data is good data, and indeed that, you know, you can be well-meaning and still present the data which is actually useful to bad actors, who will make the most of it to, you know, really, you know, drive problematic agendas, even if that's not what we were intending. Mm-hmm. So I've heard this a few times, and it's sort of there in Sabine's video as well. So maybe this is worth thinking about. I mean, we do have a beta testing group. Now, when we did this project, there were only 50 scientists in that group. We now have 115, I think, if, you know, for any future surveys. But so that's one way in which we would hope to catch something before, you know, if there's something problematic, if we're going to get a really problematic result, you know, suppose you were surveying on climate change and you, for some strange reason, in the way you'd done the survey or made the statement that you were only going to get 60%, and then this was going to be plastered over headlines around the world. You know, you can certainly imagine how something could go wrong. So the idea is that you go through, I mean, there's something we call alpha testing first, which we should sort of test it on ourselves. Then we have this beta testing group. So we run the survey with this group of scientists and ask for feedback. You know, could this statement be misinterpreted in any way? We also ask them to participate, so we can maybe get a sense of whether there's going to be a strong consensus, although it's not very reliable when you only have 100 scientists involved. But anywho, if you think there's a consensus, then any who disagree, you can have an open conversation with them, because it's not a real survey. You're just, you know, doing beta testing. And then you run the survey and get your results. And if you're going to be a completely transparent entity, you may feel like you have to then publish them, even if when you look at them, you think, gosh, this isn't what we were expecting. So that's something that maybe we could debate whether you would have to do that, you know, or if you felt something had really gone wrong. In this project, for example, we got a really low results, as we discussed in the paper. We got surprisingly low results in Argentina and Mexico. And so surprising, in fact, that we felt like we wanted to run surveys in those countries again, but this time, you know, translating the statement, right, and so on, as we explain in the paper. So yeah, we didn't want to sort of pretend that hadn't happened. You know, yeah. You know, we really do want to be completely transparent and say that, so that's all transparent in the paper. But yeah, I think in general, this is an interesting topic, whether we could run these surveys, get really sort of problematic data, and this could have consequences that were just unpredictable.
I mean, something that I would definitely be interested in would be to see if there is a way of like sampling how non-scientists would receive and handle this information or something. I mean, like a sense I got when I was just kind of like, you know, sharing with people in like Discord server associated with this YouTube channel that I was going to do this review video with some people, and there's going to be a selection effect because people are going to kind of like have similar background beliefs to me in some respects of things. But, you know, people were saying, oh, that would actually, if there was something like that I could query, it would be kind of interesting for getting a sense of like what rabbit holes to go down with new information. Or if there was like a family member who was rejecting like a healthcare treatment that their doctor recommended or something, they might be interested to just like quickly find out, well, what is the consensus? Because the family member might come out with, you know, a lot of like unorthodox information that they'd kind of come across about that particular health treatment or something. And so they might be in a state of kind of, you know, well, is that right? Because they did have a lot of information, but also that seems like, you know, kind of weird that they're rejecting what their doctor's saying about this treatment. So how should I assess that? And there was at least some kind of like idea that something like this would be useful, but it would be interesting to get like good quality data on like how people would handle and receive this sort of thing, to see, you know, is it, how prevalent is it that people kind of like use it for nefarious means or misconstrue what it's kind of trying to say and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I know of a case where there was a survey run and the results were really damaging. Maybe Lance does. I don't know. Do you know that any examples, Lance? I mean, I know of lots of surveys that have been run and that have had some kind of impact, but usually positive. Like the surveys, the study that was done by Bartos et al. That one where they tried to sort of prove to the public in the Czech Republic that there was a consensus about the safety and efficacy of COVID vaccines, and then tried to show they had two groups, and they tried to show that they had a control group and the test group, and they tried to show that it made a difference. So people in the test group were more likely, based on this information, to then go out and get vaccinated. But yeah, I guess it would be more useful to have a case where the survey results were sort of really surprising and see how that affected the public, or were they just ignored?
Yeah, I don't know of any cases about scientific matters. I frequently discuss the Phil paper survey results, but I don't think those have received a lot of like public uptake, and it like what philosophers think about a priori knowledge or something isn't going to affect public policy very much. So, well, I do see people, I think, misuse that survey data on occasion in online disputes, but I don't think that it has huge practical consequences. So people will sometimes say, oh, well, the majority of philosophers think this, and so you're being arrogant or something if you disagree with that majority. People can leverage that data on consensus among experts in a field in that way. And I think some people have concerns about that. And there may be contexts where those concerns are legitimate in certain contexts, but that kind of potential misuse has to be weighed against the value of obtaining the data in the first place. At virtually any data that we obtain about anything could potentially be subject to misuse. And I think it would be a mistake for people to express a speculative concern that data could be misused as a reason to be against the acquisition of the data in the first place.
Yeah.
It might be good to get ahead of the game, because I suppose if there's a way to get bad data that can be used by bad agents, then maybe we should do it before they do, but then explain why. When you publish it, you then explain explain the data and sort of say, well, here's why we got here's why we think we got what we got.
I can think of a good example. I have actually. So maybe a good example would be like something about either like asking scientists if they thought like lockdowns prevented transmission, or if vaccines prevented transmission of COVID or something like that, right? And then someone could kind of like present that in a way where it was clearly saying, so they didn't work, right? Because the consensus says they didn't prevent transmission. Whereas there's some kind of like further work you need to do about establishing whether they were ever supposed to prevent, so maybe something like that is a good example of, something more controversial that can be misused.
I mean, one of the good things about being able to do follow-ups without worrying about, survey fatigue is that if you get some surprising results and you think, we actually asked the wrong question. We went through all our safety checks, but still, nevertheless, the wrong question got through. Then, you can wait a month or 2 months and then ask a slightly different question or in a slightly different way. And then you can present the results together and say, look, what we found is that if you ask this way, you get these results. If you ask this other way, you get these other results. And
right.
That's, in this new survey we've done about the existence of extraterrestrial life, we do like a staggered survey where we wait a couple of months between asking questions, partly because we wanted to ask one question at a time, but it's also partly it's useful to sort of see what results you get for this statement and then sort of regroup and think what would be the ideal next statement to ask. and then run another survey, and then again. So that's another project that we did that will be coming out soon.
Yeah, sounds interesting. So I guess then we've kind of like covered all of the objections, or all of the kind of like details, I guess, in terms of communicating what the work is that you're trying to do. Is there any sort of like last thing that you'd want people to hear to look out for in terms of like the future kind of outputs of this research that you're doing or something?
I think, like, taken together, the paper that we have out already and this new one that's coming out in Nature Astronomy, I think they're good to sort of take as a pair, because they are slightly different. In fact, in the case of asking about the existence of extraterrestrial life, we decided that we wanted to ask astrobiologists, broadly construed. So I think we asked something like 1,300 astrobiologists. So this was more, and they were more spread out across institutions all over the world. So it wasn't practical to get somebody internal to the institution to send all the emails. So in this case, I actually sent the emails myself. It still worked out pretty well. We still got a pretty high response rate. And then we also asked sort of non-astrobiologist scientists to see, to get the contrast with them compared with astrobiologists. It's interesting to see the difference between asking about basic, complex, and intelligent extraterrestrial life. So you get these sort of comparisons. One reason that's useful data, I think, is because the exact result you get for each one may not be that important, but the differences between them might be meaningful. So even if you there's some noise in each signal, as long as the noise is pretty similar across the three, right, then you can still say something like, oh, the results from here to here are bigger than the results from this statement to this statement. And that can be meaningful, even if the specific amount isn't meaningful. In the same way that, for example, if you don't think that 93% is a meaningful result for is COVID caused by a virus, you could run another survey.
Yeah, and flu caused by a virus or something?
Yeah, and then see what the difference is, and then you can at least make a claim about there being a lower agreement about this than that. So you can get these interesting results which actually aren't dependent on the specific number. Right. There's one thing I think we got out of this, which maybe is obvious from the paper, is that the specific number, there is no specific number. It depends how you do it and who you ask, and there are all these decision points along the way. So this actually made us think that this idea in the public consciousness that the consensus on climate change is 97%. I don't think that's actually true. It's just that that's one result you can get if you ask certain scientists in a certain way about climate change, but you can get higher and you can get lower, and we shouldn't put too much weight on these specific numbers.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, definitely, thanks for coming on to kind of like communicate this work that you're doing. Always appreciate having people who kind of come out of academia for a bit to talk about this stuff to a broader audience and give up their time. So yeah, thanks for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks for setting it up.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks for coming, Lance.
Yeah, I'll end the stream there.
Great.
Be sure to like the video, leave a comment if you're watching, and share it around with people you think might be interested. Bye.